The worst in the world is China. They've been in the process of updating their data over the course of the last couple of years, and they're now starting to publicly admit that they overcounted by 100 million people. All of those people would have been born since one child, so age 40 and under, the young worker demographic, the childbearing demographic, and 2/3 of them are probably women. So best guess is that China only has 1.3 billion people now. The population probably peaked more than 10 years ago. And by 2030, there will be more retirees than workers. And by 2050, the entire population of China will have dropped below 650 million.
That's wild.
It's beyond terminal. Yeah, so the Chinese system collapses this decade for sure, assuming nothing else goes wrong. And there's plenty other competitors to put the bullet in China's head. Yeah, all the way from pre-industrial to post-industrial collapse in 45 years. Sure, well, there's two things. First of all, of course, as one child, Mao was concerned that they had a young upcoming generation after World War II that was going to eat the country alive. So they went to a two-child policy, ultimately to a one-child policy, and that was not loosened until 2015. But by that point, the damage was already done because there was a second factor. Remember, countries that industrialize later can follow the path of those who came before. They can skip some steps. So China was the fastest ever industrialization experience. What the United Kingdom did in 7 generations, the Chinese did in 1. And so they crammed 7 generations of economic growth and development into 1, and that's why their growth rate has been so impressive. But you can only do that once, and now it's behind them. And now they have no children, and they have very few people under age 45. That is only true in this shift from pre-industrial to industrial. Well, it depends upon how you apply the lessons to your system. In the case of Europe, I'd say they got it 3 times. But there's definitely an upper limit. One of the things to keep in mind, especially when you're talking about European demographics, is that in Europe, people are not living longer. Overall lifespan has not improved. What's improved is we've gotten rid of a lot of mortality. So the things that used to kill you when you were 0 to 65 don't kill you anymore. The 3 countries in the world, in the advanced world, actually in the advanced and in the developing world, New Zealand, France, United States, and largely for the same reason. They're countries that have a little bit more physical space. So their cities tend to be more of a sprawl. You're more likely to have a backyard. More people can live in the countryside and be economically viable. So when these 3 countries urbanized, they did it at a slower rate, and they remain the 3 advanced countries with the lowest urbanization rates in the world. In the advanced developing world, the closest one is going to be Mexico, and for similar reasons. Central Mexico, which is on a highland massif, is just one giant suburban sprawl, and that means that people can have more children. Now, all of these countries still have their own demographic hiccups. They all have the baby boomer problem. It's just that they all have replacement generations. So in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, and this is a very broad array of countries, it's very difficult to make a generalization. They've started to industrialize, and so they're going down the same path that everybody else did. And the first step of that path is lowering infant and child mortality. And so when 1 out of 3 children don't die, you have an explosion in your birth rate. But if you play that forward 10, 15 years, then you start having adjustments in family planning, and you get smaller and smaller families as urbanization kicks in. The danger for countries that are in this category who've taken the first but not the second step is that they've imported a lot of the technologies of industrialization, which has helped them out, but they have not developed the systems to sustain that themselves. So if something happens to the outside environment, they lose all of the benefits, healthcare, medicines, fertilizers. It's very easy for me to see a lot of these countries facing famine in the not too distant future, because if you break down globalization, yes, that means it's difficult to get oil or manufactured goods. I'm more concerned about agriculture. Agriculture is by far the most delicate and vulnerable of the economic sectors because it needs the equipment, it needs the finance, it needs the fertilizers, it needs the trade options. You break any of those, the whole system falls apart. And with the Ukraine war, we are seeing massive disruptions to the fertilizer sector. With some of the decisions the Chinese have made, same thing. So we're already looking this year at losing roughly 1/3 of global fertilizer supply. That is going to haunt us for a decade. So when you move into a city, you have less room, and that just changes the mechanics of raising kids. When you move off the farm, kids are no longer free labor. You have fewer of them. When you urbanize, when you have electricity, you've generated time. And so people can do things after sunset. This is important for everything in terms of economic development, but it's most important for women. Because if a woman moves off the farm and into the city and all of a sudden can do something after hours, you have the opportunity for mass education and freeing them from doing more than just being mothers. Nothing wrong with being a mother, but it's a full-time job on the farm. In the city, you're going to have fewer kids. That's less time allotted, and you have a greater chance to, read. And so the entire women's right movement is basically linked indelibly to electricity. And once you have it, women have fewer kids because they now have other things going on in their lives that compete for attention. The British example with the cotton mills was probably the best example. The first group of people to urbanize weren't the men. It was the women. And we saw the impact on birth rates. I don't think that the Chinese have a food crisis that is impacting their ability to have calories at the moment. Chinese land is among the worst in the world, and so it requires a huge amount of fertilizer to grow anything, specifically phosphate for rice. It's by far the world's most phosphate-hungry crop, and the Chinese traditionally, because of that, have been the world's largest producer and exporter of the stuff. The problem is actually with African swine fever. Now, you may have heard of that a few years ago. They had a big outbreak. They ended up culling more hogs from their farms than the rest of the world's commercial farms have hogs. They went to rebuild their herds, but they never abrogated the debts for the farmers who went out of business. They just offered subsidies to bring in new people. They thought that would be cheaper. Well, you have now 2 million new hog farmers in China who have no idea what they're doing. And let's just say that phytosanitary does not translate into Mandarin well in the first place. So we're probably in the early stages of a second wave of ASF that'll probably be just as bad, if not worse, than the first one. So pork, just like it did 2-3 years ago, is about to fall off the market in China completely. That just leaves rice. So the Chinese have banned the export of phosphate fertilizer. In the short term, this is causing massive problems in agricultural producers in East and South Asia. Australia, especially Western Australia, is probably the part that's gotten hit hardest. Brazil is feeling the impacts. Western Australia and Brazil basically can't grow without fertilizer. They don't have soil in the way that we think of the term. It's a weird geology. But you interrupt the input flows, and it's very difficult to grow food at volume. And China, in the best of times, is on a razor's edge in terms of food sustainability, and they use about 3 to 6 times as much fertilizer as is used in the global average, just because their land is so poor. Luckily, phosphate they've got covered. They produce that themselves, but the nitrogen is all made with imported natural gas, and the phosphate, the potash, half of that comes from a different continent. So, yeah, China, demographic collapse, unavoidable. Food collapse, highly likely. And that's before you start talking about things like energy manufacturing and trade.